Welcome to Art Projects. We're on lesson 2 of our 4 lessons to make this art project of pointillism fruit. So you have to watch these lessons in sequence, lesson 1, and now this is lesson 2, and we have 2 more after this. I'm Pat Nepley, and I'm so glad you're with me for this particular lesson. Now, here's what you need for today. You'll need your drawing that you did from lesson 1 of your fruit arrangement. You'll need your actual fruit handy in that same arrangement that you used. A pencil, a good eraser, a waxy coated paper plate, we're going to use that as a palette, a collection of acrylic paint craft bottles. You'll need your 3 primaries, yellow, red, and blue, and you'll need your 3 secondaries, green, orange, and purple, and you'll need white. And you'll need a whole bunch of cotton swabs and a napkin or a paper towel. Okay, so when we started this project, we learned about the French post-impressionist artist Georges Seurat and how he was so interested in color theory and the science behind color. Even though he was an artist, he was a very disciplined artist and he wanted to try something new. So when he learned how you can use optical mixing, where instead of mixing a color on the palette, you could place 2 colors close together on the canvas and the eye would perceive the 3rd color. And so this particular thing, Seurat took it to the extreme by creating a technique known as pointillism, very small dots placed on the canvas instead of traditional brush strokes. So let's take a look at one of his pointillism paintings. This is known as the Seine at La Grande Jatte. Now this is a common subject matter. This was a very famous park on an island in the middle of the Seine River in Paris. This was painted in 1888. Now, it was a very famous park. A lot of Parisians would go there from all walks of life, all classes, and that's where they would go to spend a beautiful time on a Saturday or a Sunday with their families. It was a lovely park, a very tranquil place. Do you have somewhere like that near you? A park that you like to go to with your family? Maybe it's a beach park or somewhere in the city. It's wonderful to have those kinds of places. Lovely creation in nature that you can be around that refreshes you and restores you. And that was that kind of place for Seurat. In fact, you'll notice if you look at his collection of work, most of his work takes place along the Seine River in Paris and at this island of La Grande Jatte. So let's look at this beautiful scene of a river, the Seine River, and you'll see there's a single scull. A scull is a very narrow boat with 1 rower. And there's a small sailboat in the distance. And the most prominent thing in this arrangement, the focal point, is this large tree on the edge of the riverbank going over the river. And you'll see it is on the right-hand side, and the foliage from this tree dominates this painting. If we look carefully at this river, we could say that the water is blue. That is the predominant color, but you see lots of light being reflected. There's lighter areas and perhaps even some shadows of the buildings of the city in the distance. Now, this is important to look at, the predominant color, because that's called the base color. This is the color that the viewer sees the most. And if you were to say, what color is that river? You'd say, well, it's blue. But when you look closely, friends, there's a lot of different colors going on there. Seurat added dots of green and purple and orange and yellow. I see a lot going on there. That's the whole key behind pointillism. The eye perceiving a lot of shimmer and light and shadow and highlight, all based on the carefully placed dots. So we're going to do that with our fruit arrangement, but we have to start with our base color. So just like for this river, the base color is blue, you're going to have a base color for your fruit. So for me, I'm going to start with my first base color, which is going to be my apple. So here's what you're going to do, friends. You're going to take one of your paper plates as a palette, select your first fruit, and decide what is the base color. And squeeze out a little puddle. Now, not too much because we don't want to be wasteful, but we're also not going to keep our puddle of paint quite like that. We're going to be doing a pointillism technique, and there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, which I'm going to share with you. In order to start, take a cotton swab, and what I'd like you to do is kind of spread the puddle out so it's not so thick. So you're kind of spreading it out a little bit like that. Great. And when you're finished with that swab, you're going to put it on the paper towel. We're going to collect all of your dirty swabs. We don't want to put them directly on the table, so make sure you have a paper towel or napkin that can collect them. Now, you can see by looking at that red, that's just the pure hue of red, that it doesn't look anything like my apple. Well, we're going to be adding a lot more color to it to get the effect that we want, but there is a base color, and that's where we're going to start. And you might say, well, the pear isn't really the green out of the bottle, but it does have green in it. So don't be turned off the fact that your bottle paint doesn't match your exact fruit. That's okay. The river starts off with a base of blue, but a lot of color is added in to get that effect we want. So let's talk about how we're going to do our pointillism technique. You'll notice there's no paintbrushes because we're using our cotton swabs as our tool. Now, in order to get a nice small point, and the smaller the point, the smaller the dot, the more detail we can get, we're going to only hold our cotton swab perfectly up and down, and you're going to just dip the very tip so that you have just a little bit of paint. And when you go to place your dot, you're not going to smash the cotton swab down. You're going to just lightly touch it down so you get a little dot. In fact, you should be able to get several dots with just one dip into the paint. You also, friends, don't want to drag the cotton swab like you're using it like a paintbrush like this, because we're trying to stay with little dots. Now you can imagine this requires a lot of patience because we're placing little tiny marks, but you're going to get really good at it as you do it. Now the key is you want the dots to look fairly even, about the same size, about the same application of paint. So to get started, friends, we're going to actually make our dots along our contour, which means our outline of our first fruit. And I'm holding it directly up and down, and I'm getting several dots out of the same application of paint. And I keep my dots nice and close together. And when I see that my paint is starting to wear off, I redip. So you see how I'm just going around the contour, and I can get 2 or 3 dots before I have to redip. And I'm not smashing, right? Now when the shape starts to change and you say, wow, I don't know, my cotton swab doesn't look very roundish anymore, then you flip it over and you use the other end. Now, I'm taking my time because I want to make sure my dots are about the same size and right up against each other and about the same level of paint. Now you're probably thinking already, wow, Miss Pat, this is going to take some time. Yes, it will, friends. Any new technique is going to take some time. Now here I'm getting close to my banana, which is going to be yellow. So this is where I want to be very careful that I place my dots for my pointillism technique carefully around where the two forms are going to meet. Now I finished the outline, but I have to fill in that entire apple. So I can probably work a little faster now, and I can get a lot of dots with one dip of paint. Did you see that? Now it's starting to, the paint looks like it's starting to go away. I'm running out. But I'm able to get quite a few dots with one dip and keeping my cotton swab straight up and down. Now you're going to leave a little bit of white space because we are going to be adding a lot of paint going on. So right now be filling in your first fruit with your first color. You don't have to fill in your form with dots in a certain sequence or in a straight line. You can just fill it in randomly as long as the whole form gets filled in. Now the white will be added optically with your color, and that makes a new color. When you add white to a color, that's called a tint. So you probably already know what a really light tint of red is called. That's pink. But most people don't think of it as a tint of red, they just think of it as pink. But red with white added, which is a tint, is pink. red. So that's a very light hue of red. Now what if you were to add black? Well, that's called a shade. When you add black to something, so black added to red would make what we would commonly call maroon. So it's just black and red, so it's another hue of red. So your eye, if you leave a lot of white, will optically add with these dots to make a lighter shade. And that could be what you want. But I know that this apple is actually a dark red apple, so I'm going to fill in as many dots as I can. I'm getting pretty far without having to flip over. If you feel like you need a better round shape on the end of your cotton swab, you can flip over. And where I see too much white, I'm going to go back. Now, the thing with pointillism, friends, is that it builds up in layers. And that's what Seurat discovered. That it wasn't just one dot that was on that space. He was going to go over and over until he achieved the effect that he wanted. So we're going to be doing the same thing. We're going to be building up in this fruit arrangement in layers. In fact, when they did cross-section x-rays of Seurat's work, especially Sunday Afternoon Island of Le Grand Jatte, which is his large masterpiece, 7 feet by 10 feet, when they did cross-section x-rays, they could see 6 and 7 layers of dots. So he worked a long time to get just the right effect. So I'm almost finished with my base color. Now this actually looks like the color of a cherry more so than an apple. So we know we have more work to do to mix in the way that Seurat wanted. But my basic form in my base color, red, eventually it will be like this, friends, where through additional dots of additional colors we'll achieve the effect that we want to look like a real apple. Okay, so we're finished with our first form. How does yours look? Did you get to fill it in? Now we're going to move on to our second, and so I want to make sure that my swab is away. If you have a lot of room on your palette, since we don't want to waste, you'll keep that there. And so I think I'm going to move on to my pear. And so my pear is mostly green. Well, actually it's yellow-green. But since I know I'm going to be making my banana yellow, I don't want to make my pear base color the same as my banana, so I'm going to use the green. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use a swab to spread out the puddle so it's not super thick. That way when I dip, I don't get too much paint. And I'm ready to start with a clean swab. Make sure it's nice and tight. To do the same thing with my pear. Hold it nice and vertical. Dip just the tip, and I'm going to do the contour. Now while you're doing your fruit, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Seurat. Seurat, after he spent some years in the art school, he had a very good friend that he went to art school with, and they got an apartment together and had their studio. And this is after he spent a year in the military. And he loved the military life. It was very, very disciplined life. And he was like that with his painting. All of his friends would be very free and easy, where they would paint when they felt like it. Sometimes they would go down to the cafe, meet up with other artists, or walk along the Seine. But Seurat was very disciplined in that he would spend a certain number of hours in the studio, certain number of hours outside, sketching and doing oil sketches in the air, plein air, meaning outside where the things were, especially since he loved to do things along the Seine. And he would make sure he kept those hours, like he was clocking into a job. He was very serious about his work. He was also a very secretive guy, kind of quiet. Everyone liked him because he was very smart, but he wasn't real outgoing, didn't have a lot of friends over. And people would sometimes call him the notary because he would dress very dapper in a suit and a top hat, whereas a lot of his artist friends were much more carefree. You know, because Sarah was so disciplined, it reminds me of a verse I want to share with you that's in 2 Timothy. You keep on painting while you listen to me. This is a great verse, friends. 2 Timothy 1:7. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. You know, self-discipline is a great trait to have. I'm not necessarily talking about the self-discipline to make sure we make art every day, although I would love that, but the self-discipline to lead a righteous life that follows after Jesus. There probably is some part of your life where you need some more self-discipline. Maybe it's with the amount of time you spend on the computer, or the food that you eat, or the self-discipline to get yourself up in the morning and do your schoolwork, whatever it is. Everybody needs to work on making sure they have self-discipline, but we don't have to try it alone, friends. God promises us that He's going to send the Holy Spirit, and that's what's going to help us have self-discipline. In fact, self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit. Hey, and we're doing fruit right here. How about that? So Sarah had a lot of self-discipline, more so than a lot of his other friends. Now, I'm finishing up this second fruit. If it's taking you a little longer to fill in your form with your base color, just pause the DVD and come back and join me when you catch up. So the tip of my cotton swab is starting to get a little frayed, and I'm getting little hair shapes in it, so I'm going to flip it over and start with the fresh side. Now that's starting to get frayed too, so I'll need a new cotton swab. And that happens. That's better. Now there were other artists besides Sarah who explored this idea of pointillism, not to the extreme that Sarah did. He was very dedicated to this technique he developed. But there was an artist named Camille Pizarro who also did pointillism, and Alfred Sisley. So if we get a chance, check out those artists and their work as well. Sarah was able to be so disciplined in his work because he did come from a wealthy family, and he received a monthly allowance that allowed him to concentrate on his artwork and spend all of that time and not worry where his next meal would come from. And that was not the case with most artists that were studying in Paris at that time. Most of them pooled their resources, would take odd jobs in order to support their life as an artist. So Sarah was very blessed. Most people think of artists as being carefree and easy. But you know, God made us all unique. Some artists are messy and carefree, and some artists are like Sarah, where they're very disciplined and exact and methodical. And that's okay. You were designed the way God wanted you to be. You don't have to fit a mold simply because you like to do art. Now, are you starting to get a little sloppy because you're doing so many dots? Don't let that happen. Still be controlled. Try and keep your dots all the same size. Don't rush just because you see that you're heading towards the end, because you'll be so happy with the results, my friends, if you take your time to keep your technique the same throughout. And that certainly is what Sarah did. He realized it was going to be painstaking, but he wanted to achieve an amazing result, which he did. No one had ever seen anything like this pointillism painting that Sarah had done. So you can see I'm nearing the end of my pear base color. This is simply our base color. That's the predominant color, where if you were to ask, what color is that? That would be your answer. one more piece of fruit to go, but I'm worried that my palette might get too messy. I don't want to mix any colors, so I'm going to set that aside and start with a fresh, clean palette for my last piece. And you can certainly see that this shade of yellow for my banana is not the yellow of the actual banana, but is our base color. So first, I'm spreading it out to make a thinner puddle, so it's never too thick in any one area. Great. And a nice clean cotton swab to start. Now this banana goes up against two different colors of wet paint. So when you go to do your contour in those areas, you have to be very careful, my friends. So we're going to do the same thing. You're going to outline your contour. And with lighter colors, it is a little more challenging to see the dots right along that line. Make sure your dots or your points are right up against each other. No, but try to keep them as dots, no smearing or dragging. And when you're up against this next color, just take your time. My shape starts to change a little here. There's my little stem of my banana. Now for the base color, I don't really have to look at my actual real fruit arrangement too much, except to determine what the base color is, because we're not at the point where we're getting into the realism of the fruit yet. My dots are all about the same size. Good. Keep going, my friends. Stay disciplined. Don't rush. Now, some of Seurat's friends thought he was kind of crazy for doing this technique. They understood his interest in color theory and in optical mixing, but there were artists who were doing the same type of thing using strokes rather than little tiny dots, such as Van Gogh. Van Gogh would make a lot of smaller strokes on the canvas for his paintings, and the colors would optically mix as opposed to mixing them in the palette. But he could work much more quickly than someone who was doing tiny dots. So a lot of Seurat's friends thought, wow, George, you're making a lot of work for yourself. But he was so committed to exploring this technique. All right, this is starting to get too flat for me, so I'm going to flip over to the other side so I can get some smaller dots. Now you'll notice I did not fill in the stems, because we're going to do those at our last step. We're just concentrating on the forms of the fruit and the base color. We're going to be filling in those stems during our final lesson. So finish filling in your forms now with your base color, with your pointillism dots. And I'll see you next time for lesson 3.